Hey, I'm Brandon Scroggins, pastor here at Reformation Baptist Church, and I want to invite you to join me for this segment as we think about the hymn, creed, and verse of the month for the month of October 2024. This month is always a joy because this is the month that we celebrate the Protestant Reformation. And in honor of the Protestant Reformation, when Luther and Calvin and so many of the glorious reformers, weak and sinful men, certainly, but men that God raised up to be mighty warriors for the faith. And we really thank God for what he did in the 16th centuries and following. And we want a new Reformation. At the heart of that Reformation, and what we'll sing about this month, is grace alone. It's grace alone through which God saves us. Nothing within ourselves, no merit, no works, nothing within us that commends us to God. So we are going to sing of God's grace all month long through hymn number 78 from the Grace to You hymnal, or the Hymns of Grace hymnal. And the title of the hymn is Grace Greater Than All Our Sin. Julia Harriet Johnston was born in 1849 in Ohio. She had a strong Christian raising. Her father was a well-known Presbyterian pastor, and her mother left a very deep impression on her life. And her mother established, or her parents, a missionary society. Julia would later lead that society for over 20 years. She loved to write. Her words would land in Sunday school lessons, and she would author several books. But she also wrote over 500 hymns for the church. This particular hymn that she wrote dates back to 1910. Well, I want to shift gears to Daniel Brink Towner, who was born in 1850, 1 year after Julia, and he wrote the melody for Grace Greater Than Our Sin. Truly they show us what the hymn proclaims, marvelous, infinite, matchless grace, and that of God in Jesus Christ. It's freely offered, the hymn says, to all who are longing to see his face, urging us with this question, will you this moment his grace receive? This grace, the hymn says, that will pardon and cleanse within. It's taken from Romans 5, 20 and 21, which says that the law shows us the greatness of sin, but where sin increased, grace increased more. I want to read the words to this hymn. Marvelous grace of our loving Lord, grace that exceeds our sin and our guilt. Yonder on Calvary's mount outpoured, there where the blood of the Lamb was spilled, sin and despair like the sea waves cold threatened the soul with infinite loss. Grace that is greater, yes, grace untold, points to the refuge, the mighty cross. Dark is the stain that we cannot hide. What can avail to wash it away? Look, there is flowing a crimson tide, whiter than snow, whiter than snow you may be today. Marvelous, infinite, matchless grace, freely bestowed on all who believe. You that are longing to see his face, will you this moment his grace received? And as we sing that hymn, our creed or confession of the month, in light of the month of October when we celebrate the Protestant Reformation of Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the church at Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517, we are going to read through the Canons of Dort. You can easily find these through a simple Google search. We, I believe, have some copies here at church as well. I want to challenge you to read through the Canons of Dort, and I want to give you a little bit of background that takes us back to the years 1618 through 1619. Dort is a shortened form of a longer word that would represent the city where church leaders gathered to meet for this synod or for this grand meeting in 1618 and 19. This was a national synod or a meeting of Reformed churches of the Netherlands, but it had international flames. Joel Beakey writes about the Canons of Dort that this church meeting, this gathering, was comprised of 27 foreign delegates representing 8 countries, in addition to its 62 Dutch delegates. The Synod of Dort was held to settle a serious theological controversy among the Dutch churches that was initiated by the rise of Arminianism. Jacob Arminius, who lived in the latter part of the 16th century, was a theological professor, and he differed from the Reformed faith, and he made that very well known, and he differed on a number of important points. Well, after Jacob Arminius' death, 43 of his followers presented their heretical views in a document entitled The Remonstrance of 1610, and then even more explicitly later. Well, they taught, number one, that election is based on foreseen faith, the faith that God would see looking down the corridors of time that we would, in and of ourselves, exercise. Number two, they taught the universality of Christ's atonement, that His atonement was for all, even though all aren't going to heaven. Number three, the free will and partial depravity or sinfulness of man. Number four, the resistibility of grace, that you can resist the sovereign work of God. And number five, the possibility that a person could lapse from grace, even losing potentially their salvation. They asked for a revision of the Reformed Church's stance, to which the Reformed churches stood very strong. They asked for government protection. Well, this was so serious, this Arminian Calvinism conflict, that it led the Netherlands to the brink of civil war, Beeke writes, until finally in 1617, the States General voted to call a national synod, a 4-3 vote, to address this problem of Arminianism. The synod held 154 sessions over a period of 7 months. And during this synod, they began to develop these canons, these statements and principles of doctrine, which thoroughly rejected the remonstrance of 1610 laid out by the followers of Jacob Arminius. They set forth the Reformed faith, the Reformed doctrine, and there's so much more to the Reformed faith. There's so much more to the doctrines of grace and Calvinism, but what they laid out was the heart of Calvinistic soteriology, which means the doctrine of how a person is saved or born again. Well, what they were doing was refuting the errors. So there's a negative of what we don't believe, which is unbiblical, and then they were presenting forth a positive statement of truth from the Bible as explained and exposited by the Reformed theologians. It would be summarized this way. There would be 5 headings, but they would couple the third and fourth together, believing them to be inseparable. So in essence, there would be 4 sections, but 5 headings. And they would be this way. Number 1, unconditional election and saving faith are sovereign gifts of God alone. Number 2, while the death of Christ is sufficient to expiate the sins of the whole world, its saving efficacy is limited to the elect. So Christ really did die to save His people and apply the merits of His blood specifically and completely and only to their account. Number 3 and 4, all people are so totally depraved and corrupted by sin that they cannot exercise free will toward nor affect any part of their salvation. God irresistibly calls and regenerates the elect. So yes, we have free will, and we are free to do whatever we desire to do. And in a world after the garden where Adam and Eve sinned, now all we will to do in and of ourselves is sin until God changes our hearts and draws us to Himself. Number 5, God graciously preserves the redeemed so that they will persevere to the end, even through infirmities and tribulations. So Beeke summarizes it this way. It's sovereign grace conceived, sovereign grace merited, sovereign grace needed and applied, and sovereign grace preserved. And so they lay out 59 articles of faith. and then 39 rejections of the errors that they were refuting. And this is the only form of unity that was written by an ecclesiastical assembly that represented the view of all of the Reformed churches of their day. So they affixed their signatures to it, all of the delegates, and then they joined in a service of thanksgiving and praise to God for preserving the sweet and strong doctrines of God's sovereign grace. The Canons of Dort are theological statements about salvation and the character and work of God, how holy God and sinful man can be reconciled through Jesus Christ only through the sovereign initiative of God. And you ought to be familiar with these. And then finally, we're going to continue learning, memorizing Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, having already memorized verses 8 and 9. Now we're going to complete it with verse 10, which says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So we learned in the previous month that we're saved by grace alone. And now we see in verse 10, having been saved, we are called to live a life of good works. We have marching orders from heaven. We have good works that God prepared for us to do. So there's a mission, and we need to get after it. There's a great commission, and there is the need for a new reformation, to post tenebras lux, after darkness light. So we'll sing Grace Greater Than Our Sin. We'll learn the Canons of Dort, and then we will memorize Ephesians 2:10, seeking to live a life as those who have been saved by God's grace of good works. Thank you for joining me for this month's special edition of the Hymn, Creed, and Verse of the Month.